Welcome to Virtual CB1A. This is Miss Rena. And for today's lesson, we're going to talk about parent functions. We're going to focus on algebraic functions, transcendentals, some conic sections, and also trigonometric functions. So, for algebraic functions, we will start with constant functions. I'll just write here algebraic functions. So for algebraic functions, as I've said earlier, we're going to talk about the constant function first. In this lesson, we're going to discuss the graphs of different functions, the functions that I have mentioned before, and also their inverses, their restrictions if there are any, of course, their domain, their range, the forms of their equations, and other characteristics that will be very important and will serve as your foundation in studying higher mathematics. So let's start with the constant function. For constant function, it is of the form f of x is equal to c, where c is a constant. On some books, you can find other forms of this equation. Commonly, parang nakikita ko rin sa ibang aklat, minsan ang ginagamit sa kanya k. Actually, you can replace this letter by any other letter as long as it is defined as a constant, it will do. So let's start with the graph of a constant function. Ano ang itsura ng graph ng isang constant function? Lagay tayo ng Cartesian plane dito. For the graph of a constant function, you have to recall that f of x is also equal to y. Therefore, we can write this as y is equal to c. So we're going to plot c on our y-axis. Say for example, this is where c is. Gawin natin siyang red. We don't know the exact location, but this is where the point C is. Now, what will be the graph of this equation? F of x is equal to c. So, for every value that you substitute in x, it will always end up with c. Lagay tayo ng isang ng table dito. Say, for example, this is x, and this is f of x. If your x is equal to, say for example, negative 3, still you will end up with c. If it is negative 2, c pa rin yung value niya. If it is 1, it is still c. If it is 4, it is still c. No matter what you substitute in x, you will always end up with the value c. Therefore, for the graph, it is the straight line perpendicular to the y-axis and parallel with the x-axis passing through C. Let's place arrowheads to denote that it extends indefinitely on both directions. So this is the graph of a constant function. Okay? So now let's talk about the other properties of constant functions. Let's start with the domain. What will be the domain of the constant function? So the domain of the constant function will be the set of real numbers. Or, if you prefer to write it in this notation, it is okay. You can also write it in set builder notation, x such that x is an element of the set of real number. So you can write it as an interval notation, as this script or this symbol, or as a set or in set builder notation. So any value in x can be substituted for our equation, and you will always end up with the value c. Now, what will happen with the range, or what will happen to the range? So for the range, take notice that you will always end up with the value c. So dito, it is equal to C. Or if you prefer to write it as an interval notation, so it is closed in C. So we are going to use square braces. So C, C, or square bracket. So the range will always end up with, or the range will only contain the single value C. Wala siyang ibang magiging value on the set of output aside from C. Now let's talk about the restrictions. Will there be any restriction? Yes. Ano lang yung restriction niya? So this is a function as long as C is an element of the set of real number. Basta real number siya, it can be plotted along the y-axis. Pwede. Or magka-count or valid yung value natin for C. Now, what will be the nature of this function? Is it odd or even? So, lagay natin dito, odd ba siya or even? So, you have to recall that if functions are even, it is symmetric about the y-axis. If it is odd, it is symmetric about the origin. Or pwede nyo rin naman siyang i-test this way. If f of x is given and f of negative x is still equal to f of x, it is even. But if f of negative x is equal to negative f of x, then it is odd. And of course, kapag wala siyang na-satisfy dito sa dalawa, then it is neither even nor odd. So let's see. If you substitute the values, wala pala ako ditong 3. Lagay natin dito 3. Di ba C pa rin siya? So if you substitute f of 3, it is C. If you substitute negative 3 for x, f of negative 3, you will still end up with 3. So the value of f of negative x is still equal to f of x. Therefore, this is even. Visually, pwede nyo rin naman siyang tingnan. If it is symmetric about the y-axis, kung magre-reflect siya or pantay siya pagdaan sa y-axis, then it is even. If you will take notice, para siyang nag-reflect nung dumaan sa y-axis. Therefore, it is even. So, this is even. Okay? Now, what will be the general form of constant functions? So, the general form is ay plus b is equal to 0. Okay? So, I hope that was clear because this time, we're going to move forward to another algebraic function pa rin. But, we're going to talk about the linear function. So, what will be the parent function of a linear function? Copy lang natin to. Saglit, medyo matagal siya. Okay, this time, let's talk about linear functions. So what will be the parent function of linear functions? So the parent function of linear functions is f of x is equal to x. This is also called as the identity function. So, ang parent function ng linear functions ay f of x is equal to x or the identity function. Please take note of that. So, what is the graph of the identity function? Again, lagay tayo dito ng isang Cartesian plane. And then, insert tayo ng table. So, we have x, and this is f of x. Let's try some values for x. Negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2, 3. So, pagdating niya dito, for the set of values for f of x, still, it will be negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2, 3. So, kaya siya identity function. Your input in x will be the same as your output, f of x. Dito, for the graph, let's plot the values. At negative 4, it is still negative 4. At 3, it is 3. Random na lang yung mga ilalagay kong values, ha. At 2, it is 2. At 0, it is still 0. Now, let's draw a line connecting all the points. Yan sila. And let's put arrowheads to denote that it will extend indefinitely on both directions. So this is the graph of the identity function, the parent function for a linear function. Now, let's talk about the characteristics of the identity function. First up, we have the domain. So for the domain, since we don't have any restrictions here, every value in x can be substituted and it will give you the same values in y. So we have here negative infinity to positive infinity, or the set of real numbers, or in set builder notation, x such that x is an element of the set of real numbers. For the range, since parehas lang naman sila lagi na magiging content, sa input at sa output, we have negative infinity to the positive infinity, or the set of real numbers, or any value x such that x is a real number. Those will be the contents of your output or your range. Now, let's talk about the restriction. Ay, meron pa pala. Mag-inverse muna tayo. What is the inverse of this function? If you still remember, when looking for the inverse, all you have to do is to write it using the variable y in place of f of x. And then after that, solve for the value of, or interchange y and x, and then solve for the value of y. So, dito interchange lang daw natin si x at si y. Parehas pa rin. Babalik pa rin siya sa y is equal to x. So, the inverse is the same as the parent. So, kung ano yung parent function niya, yun din ang kanyang inverse. For every linear function, ganun din. For every identity function, ganun. Now, let's talk about the restriction. So, unlike dun sa kanina natin, balikan natin kanina si algebraic function. Ang restriction niya, basta si c ay element of the set of real numbers, pwede, okay lang. Dito, ang restriction natin will be m is not equal to 0. So, bakit? If m is equal to 0, what will happen? So, you will end up with f of x is equal to 0. Magiging constant function na siya. Hindi na siya identity function. If you still remember, we have y is equal to mx plus b. This is in the form y is equal to x. So, m is 1. Pag si slope niya is naging equal sa 0, you will not have the identity function. Instead, you will end up with the constant function. Okay, so our restriction will be the slope should not be equal to 0. Now, let's classify this function. Is it odd or even? Sabi natin kanina, if our function is symmetric about the origin, then it is odd. Or, sabi rin natin kanina, if f of negative x is equal to f of x, it is even. If f of negative x is equal to negative f of x, it is odd. So, check natin. If your x is equal to 3, what will happen to your function? So, f of x will be equal to 3. Now, let's check. If we use negative x, you will end up with negative 3. Substitute natin. F of negative 3 is equal to negative 3. So, ang nasatisfy niya, yung property ng odd functions. So, this is now an odd function. Or visually, parehas yung itsura niya pagdaan sa origin. It is symmetric about the origin, so it is odd. Now, let's talk about the important forms of equations when we are talking about linear functions. So, sa linear functions, yung mga importante form ng equation niya, yung lagi natin ginagamit, y is equal to mx plus b. This is the slope-intercept form. Ano pa yung lagi natin ginagamit when dealing with linear functions? We also often use y minus y sub 1 is equal to m times x minus x sub 1, which is the point slope form of linear functions. And of course, the general form, we have ax plus by plus c is equal to 0. Okay? I hope that was clear. Now, let's move forward with another algebraic function. So, tapos na tayo sa degree 1, linear. Degree 2 na tayo. So, we have the quadratic function. Ano ang parent function ni quadratic function? So, the parent function is f of x is equal to x squared, which is also known as the square function. What will be the graph of the parent function of a quadratic function, which is a square function? Gawa ulit tayo dito ng table. So, we have x, f of x. Palalakihin ko lang dito si Cartesian plane para madali tayo makapag-graph later on. Yan. So, start ako sa negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2, 3. Ayan. Kasi limited lang tayo sa space. So, for negative 3, if we input negative 3 here, you will end up with negative 3 squared, which is 9. If you have f of negative 2, you will end up with 4. F of negative 1, you will end up with 1. F of 0, it is 0. F of 1, it is 1. F of 2, it is 4. F of 3, it is 9. So, lagay lang natin sila dito. 9, 4, 1, 0, 1, 4, 9. Now, let's plot the values on the Cartesian plane. So, at negative 3, it is... Ay, ayaw na sumulat. Gawin natin red. 9. And then we have here 4. 1, 0, 1, 4, 9. And then, draw a smooth curve connecting all the points. Sana maging smooth talaga yung curve ko. Ayan. Medyo hindi ko natamaan yung isa. Okay na yan. Assume na lang natin na perfect yung drawing ko. And of course, draw some arrowheads on the endpoints to denote that it extend indefinitely on both directions. Now, punta tayo dun sa mga properties niya. What will be the domain? So for the domain, pwede ba nating i-substitute lahat ng content ng set of real numbers? Yes. So lahat ng value sa horizontal number line natin sa x-axis, from negative infinity up to the positive infinity, pwede natin siyang i-substitute. From negative infinity to positive infinity, okay lang. So for this, the domain is of course the set of real numbers pa rin. But let's look at the range. So look at the values for the range. What will happen to your square function? If you substitute negative values, you will always end up with a positive value for f of x. If you input 0, you will end up with 0. If you input positive values, you will end up with positive values pa rin. Wala kang nakitang graph na nagpunta sa third quadrant at saka fourth quadrant nung Cartesian plane natin. It is only limited to the first quadrant and the second quadrant. Di ba ang tinitingnan lang natin for the range or the values for y or the output? So dito, both the values in y are positive. Pinakamababa na niya, si 0. So for the range, included si 0, papunta sa positive infinity lang. Okay? So wala tayong value na mapupunta sa negative y-axis. Or pupunta sa third quadrant and fourth quadrant. So the range is from 0 to the positive infinity. Now, let's talk about the inverse function. So, kung hindi masyadong malinaw yung inverse function natin kanina, dun sa nagdaang example, I think it will be more clearer at this point. So, kung nakalimutan nyo na kung paano kumuha ng inverse function from your previous subjects, i-review natin siya ngayon. For finding the inverse function, all you have to do is to write it using the y notation. So, meron tayong si f of x, yung f of x notation natin, palitan natin ng y. It'll be y is equal to x squared. This is the first step. The second step will be to interchange y and x. So, magiging x is equal to y squared. After that, solve for the value of y. So, paano natin makukuha yung value ng y? We have square root of x is equal to the square root of y squared. This way, you will end up with square root of x is equal to y. Ibalik natin siya sa f of x notation. So, we have square root of x is equal to f of x. But remember that this is the inverse of the square function. So, lagyan natin dito na notation na superscript na -1. So, the inverse of our square function is square root of x. Baka mamaya may magtanong, this is not a function. Baka may mag-contest mamaya. We are going to make restrictions to make this a function. Kasi i-violate niya yung rule natin. Di ba, meron tayong mga relations na 1-to-1, 1-to-many, at saka many-to-1. Meron siyang i-violate dito, kaya hindi siya magiging function. So, we are going to set restrictions to make this a function. So, this is the inverse function for our square function. We have f of negative inverse of f of x is equal to the square root of x, or the inverse of the square function is equal to the square root of x. Now, let us look at the restrictions. Are there any restrictions? Wala. Pwede mo i-substitute kahit anong value for the domain. So, wala tayong restrictions for the algebraic function, quadratic function, with parent function, square function. Let's see. Is this odd or is this even? Sabi natin kanina, if symmetric siya about the y-axis, it is even. Pag symmetric siya about the origin, it is odd. So, symmetric siya about the y-axis. Therefore, this is even. Okay? Now, what will be the general form of quadratic function? We have ax squared plus by plus cx plus d is equal to 0. Okay. I hope that was clear. This time, let's move forward to the square root function. Ito na nga yung sinasabi natin kanina. Baka may magtanong, bakit naging function si square root? Burahin ko lang yung content niya dito para magamit ulit natin yung board. Oops. Pause ko muna. This time, let's talk about the square root function. So, the parent function is f of x is equal to the square root of x. So, sabi natin kanina, may i-violate siya. So, pakita natin dito. Kasi nga naman, if you have, parang kailangan ko siyang pahabain dito sa kabila. So, if you have x and f of x here, yung mga perfect square na lang yung ilalagay ko ha. 4, 1, 0. Yan. For 4, dalawa yung ibibigay niya sa yung output. Pwede siyang maging positive 2, pwede rin siyang maging negative 2. For 1, pwede siyang maging positive 1, pwede siyang maging negative 1. For 0, 0 lang. So, for 4, pwede siyang maging 2, pwede siyang maging negative 2. Gawin natin red. For 1, pwede siyang maging positive 1, pwede siyang maging negative 1. At for 0, it is still 0. If we are going to connect the points using a smooth curve, you will end up with this graph. And using the vertical line test, magfe-fail siya, hindi siya function. Kasi it will intersect your graph 2 times on some points. Tapos sa 0, once lang niya ma-i-intersect. So, mababiolate niya yung definition natin ng function that for every variable x, there is or for every input x, there is only one output y or f of x. So, na-violate natin siya. Gawa tayo ng mga restrictions to make this a function. So, set tayo ng domain. So, is it possible to include the set of real numbers for the domain? No. Because in algebra, if you have a negative value, say for example, c is a real number. If you have the square root of a negative number c, it will be undefined. So, the square root of negative real numbers is undefined. So, hindi natin siya pwede i-plot dito. The lowest value that this function can take is 0. So the function will start at 0 up to the positive infinity. Now, how about the range? Unahin natin yung restriction dito bago natin ilagay si range. So for the restriction, para maging function siya, we have to eliminate this part of the graph. So kailangan natin siyang burahin, kailangan natin siya matanggal. How can we do that? Ay, sorry. Ayan. So dito, for the range, if we're going to set it at 0 up to the positive infinity, i-exclude natin yung mga negative values niya dito. Excluded tong mga to, negative 2, negative 1. Then, it is going to qualify as a function. So for the restriction, bawal tayo makapunta dito sa negative x-axis. So x should always be greater than or equal to 0. And for the range, your output should be limited to 0 to the positive infinity. Okay? Now, what will be the inverse function? Though na-compute na natin siya kanina, hanapin pa rin natin yung inverse niya. Paano natin na-compute kanina? Di ba dun sa quadratic function natin, dun sa square function natin, we found out that the inverse is square root of x. So, ang inverse naman ni square root function will be the square function. So, sundan natin yung mga step kanina. Write it as y is equal to the square root of x. Step 2, interchange y and x. We have x is equal to the square root of y. Step 3, we have compute for the value of y. So, to do that, we have to square both sides. Square natin sila. You will end up with x squared is equal to y, or y is equal to x squared. So, the inverse of a square root function will be the square function x squared. Okay? Now, let's discuss its nature. Is it odd or even? So, sabi natin kanina, if it is symmetric about the y-axis, it is even. If it is symmetric about the origin, it is odd. So, is it symmetric about the origin or the y-axis? Wala siyang na-satisfy. So, this is neither. It is neither odd nor even. Now, for the general form of square root functions, we have f of x is equal to the square root of a square root of b times x minus h plus k. We're going to talk about this later on. Okay? Alright. Now, let's go to cubic function. Degree 3 na tayo. Again, copy ko lang to. Burahin natin yung content so we can use it again. Dito na tayo sa cubic functions. What is the parent function of a cubic function? It is f of x is equal to x cubed. What is the graph of a cubic function? Kung gusto nyong mag-isa-isa ulit dito. But I will skip this part na kasi kanina pa natin siya ginagawa. If you want to draw the graph manually, you can always use the tabular technique or tabular method mag-set kayo ng mga values ng x. Look for the value of f of x, and then plot the points. After that, draw a smooth curve connecting all the points. Pero skip ko na yung part na yun kasi kanina pa naman natin siya ginagawa. So what is the graph of a cubic function?
Ring. Ring, ring.
Saglit lang. Okay, so I will just plot here some obvious points. So at negative 2, it is negative 8. At negative 1, of course, it is also negative 1. At 0, it is also 0. At 1, it is 1. At 2, it is positive 8. And then just draw a smooth curve connecting all the points. And then just, sorry, hindi maganda masyado yung graph ko. You can always use Desmos application or any graphing calculator or graphing tool, graphing app to draw the graphs of the functions. So, ganito yung magiging itsura niya. Medyo ganito yung magiging itsura niya. Now, let's talk about the properties. Let's start with the domain. Is it possible to substitute all the values in x? Yes. So, wala tayong restriction. Pagdating kay x, lahat ng value ni x, pwede mong i-substitute. So, for the domain, we have negative infinity to the positive infinity. How about the range? For the range, may restriction ba tayo? Again, wala. Pupunta siya sa mga negative values ni y, pupunta rin siya sa mga positive values ni y. So, the set of real numbers pa rin. We have the negative infinity to the positive infinity. Next, let's talk about the inverse. What will be the inverse? Compute ulit tayo ng inverse. We have f of x is equal to x cubed. Ang parent niya, we have y is equal to x cubed. Interchange y and x. We have x is equal to y cubed. Now, to get the value of y, sulat nga natin siya dito. X is equal to y cubed. You have to use, or you have to extract the cube root. We have cube root of x is equal to the cube root of y cubed. So, the cube root of x is equal to y, or the inverse function of a cubic function is the cube root of x. Okay? Are there any restrictions? Wala. Now, let's look at the graph. Is it odd or even? So, since it is symmetric about the origin, nag-reflect siya pagdaan sa origin, then it is odd. Okay? Now, what is the general form? The general form will be f of x is equal to a times b times x minus h cube plus k. So, last two. Dito na tayo kay cube root. Lagay ulit tayo ng isa pang page. So, pagdating kay cube root function, the parent function is f of x is equal to the cube root of x. So, pakita na lang din natin dito yung graph. So, parang ganito yung magiging itsura niya. Of course, ayan. The cube root of negative 8 is negative 2. The cube root of negative 1 is 1. The cube root of 0 is 0. The cube root of 1 is 1. The cube root of 8 is 2. And then just draw a smooth curve connecting all the points. So, ganyan yung magiging itsura niya. Yan. So, for here, what are the things that we should take note of? Let's start with the domain. So, for the domain, may restrictions ba tayo? Wala. So, from the negative infinity to the positive infinity, pwede siya i-substitute lahat. For the range, what about your output? May restrictions ba? Again, wala. So, from the negative infinity to the positive infinity, pwede siya lahat maging output. There's a possibility to have it as an output. Now, let's look at the inverse. So, na-compute na natin kanina, the inverse of a cubic function is the cube root function. So, obviously, the cube root function's inverse is the cubic function. So, our inverse is x cubed. If you want to check for it, pwede naman, gawin nyo lang yung mga steps na ginawa natin kanina. Interchange y and x, solve for the value of y, and then write it in this notation. F with the superscript negative 1 of x. Ay, kung ano nang nangyari. Next, doon na tayo kay restriction. Do we have any restriction? Wala. Lahat valid i-substitute. Next, is it odd or even? Again, it is symmetric about the origin. So, obviously, it is odd. What is the general form? So, for the general form, we have f of x is equal to a cube root of b times x minus h plus k. Okay? So, I hope that was clear. Last na tayo. So, for the last function under algebraic, we have the reciprocal or rational. Nag-copy na ba? Nag-copy na. Burahin ko lang to. So, we have the reciprocal. So, rational function tayo. So, what is the parent function of the rational function? So, it is f of x is equal to 1 over x. Also known as the reciprocal function. May mga aliases yung iba sa kanila. So, for the graph, hindi ko na siya ipapakita step by step. Hindi na tayo magsaset ng mga points. Lagay ko na lang dito yung magiging itsura niya. Ay, but line. Dapat curve. Ay. So, medyo ganito yung magiging itsura niya. Yan. Siyempre, hindi perfect yung drawing ko. As I've said earlier, you can use other graphing apps to graph this function. Let's talk about the domain and the range. What will be the domain and the range of this function? So for the domain, we have possible ba i-substitute lahat? Parang hindi. Bakit? So, for here, we have a restriction. Sa restriction natin, we cannot have zero denominators or zero divisors. So, isingit na rin natin dito kaagad si restriction. So, sa restriction niya, x cannot be equal to 0. So, that will leave us with from negative infinity up to 0, pwede mong makuha. And from 0 up to the positive infinity. If you will take notice, hindi tayo closed kay 0. Kasi asymptotic siya at 0. Hindi ka pwedeng magkaroon ng, asymptotic siya sa origin. Ayan. So, yung line natin passing through 0. Or the y-axis, asymptotic siya with the y-axis. Hindi mo siya madadaanan kahit kailan. So, hindi ka pwedeng magkaroon ng value na 0 sa x. So, asymptotic siya at x is equal to 0 or the y-axis. Now, for the range, since bawal siya mag-0 dito, our value for y will get closer and closer to 0 but will never approach 0. So, the range is similar. We have negative infinity to 0. Yun, 0 to the positive infinity. Now, is there an inverse? So, ang inverse niya, same lang ng parent. If you're going to check for it, you can. You will always end up with 1 over x pa rin. Now, for our nature, is it odd or even? So, look at the graph. Is it symmetric about the y-axis or is it symmetric about the origin? So, it is symmetric about the origin. Therefore, it is odd. How about the general form? So, for the general form, it is f of x is equal to a over b times x minus h plus k. So, that is the general form of rational functions. So, this will be the end of our discussion for parent functions. Sa next na lecture na i-upload ko, we are going to apply parent functions to different algebraic functions. We're going to look for the patterns on how they behave, kung paano sila nag-shift horizontally and vertically, kung paano sila nag-shrink, paano sila nag-expand, using the idea of parent functions. So I hope that was clear. Thank you very much for staying with me for about 48 minutes. And I'll see you next time. Bye!